Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're well and staying safe out there. I'm Terry Rizzo, Chairwoman of the Florida Democratic Party, and I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us today for this really important discussion about the future of our democracy. I'm really honored to be here today with some of our fearless Democratic leaders who are working so diligently to protect our democracy, as well as keeping Floridians safe in the age of coronavirus. Thank you, Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez, State Representative Tracy Davis, State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, former Leon County Supervisor of Elections, Ion Sancho, and our Florida Democratic Party Voter Protection Director, Brandon Peters. Before we start this important discussion today, I'd like to talk about our efforts to protect our democracy. The Florida Democratic Party is working to modernize our elections and expand vote by mail to ensure that everyone who is eligible to vote can vote during these uncertain times. Now, we've long supported vote by mail, and this year is especially important. One of the key things we've done this year is to partner with the Democratic National Committee to launch a massive texting campaign to encourage Floridians to vote by mail. Over the past 2 weeks, hundreds of our amazing volunteers have been texting over 1 million Floridians, Florida voters, asking them to vote by mail in this upcoming election. We've also invested in boosting vote by mail turnout among unlikely voters, sometimes called sporadic voters or warm voters, by enrolling these voters in vote by mail. And our goal is to turn Florida blue in 2020. It is so important to make sure voters are being informed and know the importance of participating in this year's election. We're doubling our efforts to connect to voters, but we're doing it online. We built an online tool to make it easier for voters to find their county supervisors of elections. We're also making calls to voters to help them if they need to enroll in vote by mail. And we're patching them through to their supervisors of elections to request a vote by mail ballot. We continue working hard to make sure voters have the opportunity to participate in elections while staying safe at home. We've been building our infrastructure for a year while waiting for our nominee. And now that we have one, we're working hard to win in November. I want to thank everybody for joining us, all those on this amazing panel, and all of you who are watching. And now I'd like to turn it over to our absolutely amazing Voter Protection Director, Brandon Peters.
Well, thank you, Chair. My name is Brandon Peters. Greetings to our Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter audiences. I am the Voter Protection Director for the Florida Democratic Party and the moderator for our wonderful panel this afternoon. We have an extraordinary group of people assembled for you. It really reads like an all-star roster of election protection. These folks are going to discuss the importance of protecting our democracy in the face of insurmountable challenges, according to some. I would like to start by introducing our friend and elections rights champion, State Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez. Senator?
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's great to be on with friends and fellow advocates. Listen, the stakes in this election could not be higher. I am so happy to join colleagues in trying to make sure that we adequately address the need to make sure that every Floridian can vote, and that the public health emergency does not stand in the way of people exercising the right to vote, and that voters in August and in November don't have to choose between their health and the health of their community, and between exercising their right to vote. The message is very, very simple for members of the general public, especially obviously Democrats, and that is the message: register to vote by mail. For those on the phone who maybe can't see the handwritten sign that I'm holding up, it says fl.dems.vote/mail. And that is a link that the Democratic Party has set up, that if you go to that link, it will take you, no matter what county you live in, it will take you to the page for the Supervisor of Elections, where you can request your ballot by mail. Go ahead and do that. It's a smart thing to do. Whether or not you actually plan to vote by mail, we don't know what the election, what things will look like in August and November. It's a smart thing to do. And then for the legislature, we're likely to be going back to Tallahassee. We need an all of the above strategy to get ready. It comes down to flexibility and it comes down to resources. The biggest part is facilitating vote by mail. That's not the only thing that needs to happen, as evidenced by the letter of April 7th by the supervisors of election. But the resources need to be there to make sure that everybody has a chance to vote. If that's vote by mail, we need to make sure that that happens. And there's a whole range of other things that we ought to be putting in place to make sure that people can be safe and vote, and that our voters and our election workforce are not put in harm's way, but we make sure we maximize voter participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And now it's my honor and privilege to introduce State Representative and former Duval County Supervisor of Elections, the representative from District 13 in the Florida House of Representatives, Tracy Davis. Representative.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you first for the invitation, and I'm so glad to be participating as a panelist among all my all-star colleagues. I just wanted to, I guess, add to what Senator Rodriguez said, in the sense that the COVID-19 has made congregating in small places very challenging now. So now that we're coming up on our election season, we have these two elections coming up, August and November. First of all, I am pushing and thankful, and I know we're all on here today, to ensure that our elections do take place. That's number one. We don't want anything postponed or rescheduled. But in dealing with our elections now, we have to make sure we're dealing with elections that are free, accurate, and safe places. And I know we're going to talk about voting by mail and encouraging folks to vote by mail today, because right now that is the safest way to go. A personal story, in working in the elections office for about 14 years, I always like to try out the systems that we are incorporating. So my colleagues knew me as the early voting queen. I voted early for several years while we were putting that together, and that was always an exciting way to vote. But I have to admit, I was always one of those folks that I was skeptical of voting by mail early on. But I have to say that I personally have been voting by mail for the last 5 years. And if we're going to talk about and encourage folks to do this, we have to ensure that we're doing it ourselves, number one, and we have to ensure and encourage them that it actually is the safest way to vote. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that more in detail, but it's definitely, it just rids us of a lot of things. Voting by mail allows a person to vote in the convenience of their own home. Voting by mail allows the elections office to deal with lessening some costs and some aspects with the poll workers, as well as some precincts. And so I'm glad to be here, glad to share my insight, and glad to have this conversation, but definitely want to encourage people to vote by mail for this upcoming election. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Representative. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our friend, the representative from District 49 in the Orlando area, Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith. Carlos?
Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar. It's really awesome to be here. My name is Carlos Guillermo Smith, and I'm a state representative from East Orange County, representing the UCF Waterford Lakes area. I'm really excited to be talking about vote by mail, and my story is a little bit different than Representative Tracy Davis's, and it's so good to be here and listen to your story. Tracy's story is different than mine. You see, she made the smart decision 5 years ago to become a vote by mail voter. I decided about 2 weeks ago to become a vote by mail voter. But I think the reason why is one that folks should hear, because I think a lot of people can relate to this. So I have always been a fan of voting in person, whether it was on election day or early voting. I love the experience of being able to show up, to stand in the voting booth, to exercise my constitutional right to vote and just kind of be a part of it all there, seeing other people there with their I voted sticker, right?
Yeah.
Everyone likes that experience.
Yeah.
So I resisted for a long time registering to vote by mail. And then COVID happened. And COVID was the reason for why, when we were in the legislature in session up in Tallahassee in the state capitol, COVID was the reason why we had to stay longer. We were supposed to end on a certain date. That was going to be the Friday before the Tuesday presidential preference primary. And I had planned to be finished by session in Tallahassee by that time. I would be back in Orlando, ready to vote in person. And then we had our session extended. I had to stay longer. And then I realized, wait a minute, I'm not a vote by mail voter, which meant that for me to actually be able to vote, I had to drive all the way down to Orlando from Tallahassee to cast my vote in person, because I had not registered to vote by mail and I did not have that option to me. I didn't anticipate that I would still be in Tallahassee on that Tuesday election, but that's the whole point of vote by mail, right? The whole
Right.
point of vote by
Makes
mail
sense.
is that you just never know what's going to happen. And you might have plans to do something and to be there voting in person on a specific date, but life happens. In this case, it was the pandemic. So we used the fl.dems.vote/mail link to find our supervisor of election to order our vote by mail ballot. And I say our because, we went ahead and registered for vote by mail for myself and for my husband, Jarek. So now we're both ready. And I see Senator is putting up that web link again. This is so, so important. And I think that we all are going to hope that our governor does the right thing and modernizes our election systems and really encourages people to vote by mail between now and August or November. But we all know better than that. I think that we need to look out for ourselves, which means we got to register to vote ourselves on our own. We can't wait for the governor to register us to vote by mail. We got to do it for ourselves. So that's what I would encourage people to do. And I'm glad to be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you, Representative Smith. And last but not least, our good friend and the former supervisor of elections from Leon County, where Tallahassee is located, Ion Sancho. Greetings, Ion. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brandon. And it's a pleasure and honor to be part of this webinar today. What I'd like to do is say that voting by mail is something that Florida can do, but our infrastructure is limited. There are a number of things that have to be practically worked out, and some of the things that right off the top of my head, 1/3 of the state uses the same vendor. And that means that the process that the supervisor of elections are going to be using to generate mail ballots is going to be at full capacity, because as soon as the large counties like Palm Beach, Broward, and Orange get their orders in, those printers are going to be stressed to the max. So a couple of practical things that I found out talking to the supervisors: they need individuals to put themselves on that mail ballot list as soon as possible, because this is going to stress the resources of most of the election officials in terms of processing mail ballots. Mail ballots are the most complex ballot to deal with in a Florida election. In-person early voting and in-person election day voting are actually far less complex than processing the mail ballots that citizens use. So getting the citizens signed up front so that the supervisor of elections can include those individuals in the numbers that they're going to be ordering from the vendors is critical. And since you have a limited number of vendors, the earlier the supervisor of elections call in to the vendors and order their supplies, and I'm talking about ballot stocks, envelopes, and those practical matters, as soon as they get that ballot built following the August primary, every county in the state is going to be slamming the vendors with those, the ballots which cannot be built in order until after the August primary. And there's only 11 weeks between the primary and the general election. So we have a logistical problem potentially right off the bat in terms of bottleneck. The supervisors would like individuals to use their websites to register to get a mail ballot. Because again, all the counties are basically used to doing it the way that has been tried and true, and that's not going to work this time if we're going to push mail ballots. So I think the party can have a great impact and help the election officials if we can promote voting by mail early in the process. That means now. So that smaller counties won't be able to afford, for example, buying high-speed processors for doing the mail ballots. They're going to be doing it with the infrastructure and the machinery they have. So that's a very, very practical problem that we need to address immediately. People need to use the websites because the supervisor elections have told me if they get deluged with telephone calls and emails and postal requests after that time, they simply don't have the staff to put these names in the list on the roll. So that's we need to look at doing that on a web-based process. So it's good to see that the Democratic Party has the web address in there, and all of the individual counties are going to have to be contacted for the most part on the internet, get into that system so that in fact it doesn't clog up the limited resources, the staffing resources that the supervisor of elections have. In addition to that, the only method that the supervisor of elections have to verify the mail ballot voter is valid is that signature. That is going to be a challenging aspect. You have a wide variety of rejections in terms of percentages across this state. There is 3% of all the registered Democrats that try to vote by mail in Manatee County are rejected today. Manatee County is an outlier in terms of registering their citizens and counting their mail ballots. So looking at these outlier counties is critical. A heavily Republican county like Pinellas, for example, does a stellar job. And in fact, every county should have numbers looking like Pinellas County in terms of their rejection rate. That's my opinion. They do it properly in Pinellas County. We've had a major loss in that Deborah Clark, who is the supervisor of elections for Pinellas County and built their mail system. She's retired the end of March. So she's gone. And quite frankly, if I wanted to go into a business promoting mail ballot, I would hire that woman and make her my number one consultant in terms of mail ballots, because they do mail ballots better than anyone with a lower rejection rate. Their rejection rate in Pinellas County is 65, I think, which means they're at the bottom. They don't reject their mail ballots. What they do in Pinellas County is what we should be doing statewide. So we don't have these ridiculous 3% rejection rates that they have in Manatee County. So I would say some of the practical issues that we need to address right off the bat, and that's where we have to begin.
Thank you very much, Ion. We appreciate that, and you make some excellent points. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to ask our panelists some questions, starting with kind of a high-level abstract question for Senator Rodriguez. Senator, you come from the Coral Gables area. That's where your district is located. speaking as a South Floridian, known by many, loved by all, how do you think COVID-19 is changing the way we view democracy in the United States?
Well, thank you for the question. Coral Gables is one of the many municipalities in my district. I live in the city of Miami, which is the bulk of my district. It goes from downtown and Alapata neighborhood all the way to South Dade in Cutler Bay, and from West Miami to Key Biscayne. So it's a very diverse district, obviously very urban district, one of the most urban in the state in terms of density. And one of the things, obviously, is I think Rep. Davis was saying it. I mean, I think she led with the fact that this pandemic and our need to protect life and protect our health of our community has required us to change behavior. And when it comes to fundamental rights like voting, that as Rep. Smith was saying, is traditionally something that we do in person, and we've sort of accommodated over the years. You know, it used to be you had to have an excuse to vote by mail. You had to be overseas or unavailable. Thank goodness that went away. Enables us to pull more people into being able to vote. But I think just from a high level, we're going to have to go. What we're talking about now. We're talking about needing resources to adjust our voting. We're talking about changing some of the rules, allowing supervisors the flexibility that they need, in addition to the resources, make sure that everybody who can vote who wants to vote, has that chance to vote as easily and safely as possible. But there's also going to be some cultural accommodation. We as Democrats are 100% committed to defeating Donald Trump and electing Democrats up and down the ballot. And we're going to have to figure out how to campaign differently. We are doing that now. And so it's also good. We're all figuring this out. But the absolute most important thing that we've got to figure out is how do we get the supervisors of elections the resources and flexibility they need so that everything else can happen. All the public education can happen, and everybody else whose job it is to make sure that people get quote unquote to the polls, right? Well, now that looks differently than it did before. So the first step is to make sure that we have the infrastructure and resources and the correct rules in place to make sure that can happen.
Representative Davis, as a former local elections official, as a former supervisor of elections, how do we get those resources and that infrastructure in place before the August primary and the November general election?
So, Brandon, as much as I would love to take that title you just gave me, I have to make sure that everyone knows I'm a former deputy supervisor of elections. So I was second in charge. I would have loved to have worn that title as supervisor, but we only have one supervisor on the panel, and that's Ion. But with that question, as far as how do we get the infrastructure in place, I do think the supervisors have sent the governor a letter asking for some of the things that State Senator Rodriguez just asked for, flexibility in what they're doing, funding in order to be able to do what they do. A big issue with the vote by mail is some counties pay for postage and some don't. Needing additional equipment. So dealing with the printing of the ballots. So it's additional things that will, need funding for in order for them to put the infrastructure in place. Supervisor Sancho mentioned the practicality of processing the vote by mail, and some of the counties having the equipment to do it and some of the counties not. So if the counties have the proper resources as far as funding, they now have the time to put that infrastructure in place. But like it's already been said, it's a timeline, and the elections offices are preparing for their August elections right now. So they need our governor to give them what they need right now. We need that sooner rather than later, so they have ample time to be able to put the infrastructure in place, so we can have a successful August as well as November election.
excellent perspective from a former deputy supervisor of elections.
Thank you,
And
Brandon.
as the deputy, you got to take all the blame and none of the glory. Sorry about that. Let me pivot to Representative Smith. Representative, while COVID-19 is putting enormous pressure on our voting systems, and we've heard a lot of panelists describe exactly how that is happening, how do you think we can make sure that our Florida elections infrastructure will be prepared to handle a much higher volume of vote by mail?
Well, thank you for the question. I think one of the things that we can do to make sure that it's prepared is to make sure that our supervisors of elections are with arbitrary deadlines. That is one of the problems we've had in the past, just even without there being the crisis of a pandemic, that supervisors of elections are forced to report some of their counts based on arbitrary statutory deadlines that have not given, possibly even have a wrong count, but also just to be able to have an accurate count and one that respects every single person who sent their ballot in and followed the rules and voted and exercised their constitutional right. One of the many policy proposals that we have been advocating for around one of these deadlines is to ensure that anyone who returns their vote by mail ballot and has it postmarked by elections day will have that vote counted. Because the reality is that while we love the United States Postal Service, sometimes it's inconsistent as far as when they might deliver a ballot. So you can have one person on the east side of town drop their ballot off on, let's say, the Thursday before the election. Another person on the same side of town can drop it off at a different mailbox on the same day, and those ballots can arrive on different days at the supervisor of election, and one ballot will count, the other will not, because it was received after the deadline. And yet the voter, each voter actually did the same thing. They both mailed their ballot on the same day. That's why it's really important for us to change and update our policy to allow for voters, for example, to have their vote by mail counted as long as it is postmarked by election day.
Thank you, sir. Supervisor Sancho, Representative Smith has just made some very good points about some of the arbitrary deadlines that are built into Florida's decentralized elections infrastructure. From your perspective, as the man who was Leon County Supervisor of Elections for 28 years, if memory serves, what do you see today in the elections code that needs to be changed as far as deadlines are concerned?
Well, I participated in suing the state of Florida in 2018 over what they call the cure provision for mail ballots. The state of Florida has the worst cure deadlines in the country, even after they've changed it to provide for a citizen to be able to go up to 2 days after the election and cure a ballot that has a minor error. That 2-day deadline, ridiculous. Florida Supervisor of Elections are going to be reporting the first official set of returns on Saturday. We can accept and count mail ballots that are postmarked properly before Election Day all the way through Saturday. But state law won't let us do that. We're going to be adding numbers to all of the provisional ballots. Won't be done until Friday. They're going to be added in on Saturday. All unscanned ballots have to be checked, and any numbers there will be added on Saturday. But the Florida legislature won't allow any properly cast ballots that aren't in the office by 7 p.m. to be counted while we're counting other ballots to add to the totals. And our military personnel serving overseas They have until the following Saturday or 10 days after the election. So we know that election officials are properly counting legal ballots and adding them all to the total of Florida's votes total through 10 days after the election. But the Florida leadership and the legislature will not allow us to tabulate these ballots. This is completely arbitrary. That 2-day cure period that we provide compares to 14 days for Oregon, 20 days in Washington, 21 days in Arizona, and 28 days that Californians get to cure a mail ballot deficiency. It's ridiculous that we provide only 48 hours. And that's only after the state was sued and the previous law was found to be unconstitutional. This is the kind of flexibility we could be talking about. We are going to be adding ballots, legal ballots, much further than 48 hours after the deadline. And election officials could be counting legal citizens, voters' ballots through that. So I would extend the cure provision so that, in fact, in an urban area, a supervisor of elections would have the time to actually send out a postcard to a citizen to let them know, hey, there's a deficiency here. All you have to do is contact our office or use the internet and send us a receipt that will in fact cure your ballot. This is not rocket science. It's just an arbitrary law that the Republicans in control of the legislature have written to make sure that citizens' votes don't count. And where that impacts particularly is on young voters and minority voters. And that's critical, as these voters have not been participating in the past, but they're starting to. For example, right now, that while in the 2016 presidential election, only 9.2% of the mail ballot voters were under 30. 30.8% of all rejected mail ballots were the category of voters. So young voters and minority voters are particularly impacted by Florida's arbitrary process. And if we had more time to send a postcard out, and that which is the only thing that'll work in the urban areas, because you don't have the staff, you can't call every one of your 100,000 voters to let them know that there's a problem, but you can send out a postcard. You can do that. And that would allow individuals to get actual written receipt and know exactly what they need to do to make sure their ballot will count before the certification period arrives. So that's a very practical issue that we need to do. Otherwise, we're asking people to vote by mail and not telling them that groups of people are 10 times more likely not to have their ballot counted if they had gone to an early voting site and voted. And that's kind of not fair. And that's what the data shows in Florida. Right now, if you vote by mail, you have a 10 times larger chance to not have that mail ballot tabulated. And there's a whole host of reasons here besides just the law. Your postal delivery is only as good as the postmaster in your area. I've had problems with postmasters. We've had to fire some or try to get them fired, because where you don't have a cooperative postmaster, you will have mail delivery problems in that jurisdiction. They had, just as they discovered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where in fact hundreds of mail ballots were not delivered to a town. And there was a back and forth effort. The voters kept sending to the right place and they kept getting kicked back. This is a problem really outside of the control of the supervisors directly to handle. And I would suggest, for example, that county chairs actually contact their postmasters and find out what the policies are. The policy of the post office should be to deliver a mail ballot to the elections office, even without postage. And in those situations, the postmaster's office will bill county supervisor of elections for it. Other counties like Leon County and others actually put money, and we paid for any mail ballot that didn't have postage. We had already given the post office before the election, opened an account and said, there's money here. If you need to put a postage on it, take it out of that account. We'll pay for it. Don't return a mail ballot to the voter.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that to Senator Rodriguez. Senator, do you think it's realistic to believe that Florida can budget return postage for mail ballot senders between now and Election Day in the fall?
Yes, I do. I mean, we're going to be going back to Tallahassee. I don't think any of us doubt that the likelihood we will be returning to Tallahassee before July 1st. I don't think any of us doubt that that's going to happen. And, you know, one of the things that I've heard discussed among colleagues is that, oh yeah, you know, this idea that, for example, it's one idea that's floating around that I think has some merit is whether or, you know, is again, we want to encourage vote by mail. That's not going to be the only way that people are going to vote. We don't know what the election, what the public health climate looks like in August and November. But one suggestion was, for example, just to automatically send vote by mail to everybody, right? So automatically enroll everybody, but then they obviously have the choice to either drop it off, come and vote in person, early vote, you know, turn in their ballot. And the pushback is, well, that may not be politically feasible because of the political will behind the funding for the supervisors to be able to make that happen. Well, that really shouldn't be an impediment. You know, I know Rep. Smith is on. You know, he and I have been calling for the governor to not send out $500 million of checks to corporate America, which is what the legislature has done. There's another at least $500 million, maybe another $1 billion in corporate loopholes that corporate tax loopholes that don't exist in most states because Florida has just decided to leave these open them, or not address them. So the idea that the funding is not available is just not accurate. It does not have to come from everyday people. And the funding is there. And the question we have is, the budget is about priorities. If we are in a pandemic, the right to vote is fundamental, right? We cannot be cheap when it comes to that. So I absolutely believe that the resources should be there. And I don't doubt that Rep. Smith, Davis, and I will go and fight very hard along with our colleagues to make sure that the legislature does the right thing, but it really needs to.
Let me ask Representative Smith to follow up on that, please.
Well, I was going to say, I think what Senator Rodriguez was alluding to was that if the state can afford to give $500 million away to the top 1% of Florida corporations, certainly we can pay for a little stamp and a piece of paper to send to every registered voter with their vote by mail. Yes, we can. We just must have the political will to do so. And we will be returning to Tallahassee at some point this summer, which is why I think it's very important for all of us Democrats to continue to encourage the legislative leaders to really take up some of these issues that have come up as a result of the pandemic, expanding vote by mail opportunities during a special session, fixing Florida's broken unemployment program and expanding the number of weeks that they're available from 12 to 26, expanding Medicaid as well, especially knowing that so many people have lost their jobs and along with that lost their health insurance coverage. This needs to be part of a broader conversation in the legislature. And I also just want to reiterate and restate that while we have had some issues that shouldn't be minimized about signature mismatches and things of that nature with vote by mail, we have to understand that this also represents a very, very, very small percentage of vote by mail ballots. And that has been consistently the case in Florida and in other places as well. So we want to do everything we can to still encourage folks to use the vote by mail process because it can be relied upon and it is the safest way to go, especially when you factor in the pandemic situation that we're in right now. I think we can all agree that by August, there's going to be a big question mark around whether we, quote, reopen the country or not, whether it's actually safe to engage in in-person voting without the social distancing. We're all going to have to be doing this social distancing, certainly for the August election, but we're probably better off just voting by mail. But if you're talking about November, which is an even bigger question mark, we know that recently Dr. Anthony Fauci, who we all love to see him during the press conferences at the White House, and we all get nervous when we don't see Dr. Fauci there at the press briefing, he even recently said that it's too early to tell and that we can't guarantee it will be safe for Americans to vote in person as late as Election Day, November 3rd.
Right.
So we got to get this done, y'all.
Right. And
Let me ask Representative. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Chair.
Brandon, yes, thank you very much. And Representative Smith, I want to thank you for that and emphasize that we don't know what's going to be happening in August or November. I look upon the vote by mail, and we do, as an insurance policy. You know, if people are able to go and vote at the polls at early voting or on election day, they can. But having that vote by mail is the insurance policy in case there are some issues. And for many people, it is a preferred method to vote. We are encouraging people to sign up for vote by mail and to do it now. As Supervisor Sancho said, that is to get it in early, get it in now, and make sure that the request, so that therefore it's the supervisors of elections around the state have the opportunity to prepare those. We believe that vote by mail is, as I said, is the insurance. And we do want to emphasize that we are working to correct and make sure that people know to correct the issues that we've referred to here. Lack of signature match, or lack of is one. Not, in fact, I understand that actually the number one problem is no signature at all. Not signing the back of the ballot. So that right, I'm seeing the answer on that. So to educate people to make sure that they do their vote by mails properly, but then get them in early at the time in case so that they can be cured or corrected if necessary. And those bring those numbers down. But out of the total numbers of ballots that are returned, and there were several million of them in the last election, it is a very, very small percentage that were spoiled for any reason and were not counted, whether it was getting there late, whether it was lack of signature, or whether it was a signature match. Very, very small percentage. And even in states that vote entirely by mail, and there are 3 of them, with 2 more added, as I understand it, Colorado has joined Washington, and Oregon has voted entirely by mail, and now Utah and Hawaii are doing it also, have a statewide vote by mail. Those, at least the first 3 states, our numbers were actually consistent with theirs. So it's those kind of problems that exist are relatively universal, but out of all ballots are a very small percentage, right? Yeah.
One last question. We're short on time here, and this one is to Representative Davis, if I may.
Wow. Okay.
Representative Davis, if you could wave a magic wand and bring any single election reform into existence in the state of Florida, what would that be, and why?
Wow. Well, let's just deal with what we're talking about here today, and trying to ensure that our elections are safe, free and accurate for everyone. And I think if I had to wave the wand, I would ensure that the federal funds, going back to the last the conversation, the 21 million in federal funds were actually given to our supervisors so they could have the resources to do what we're asking them and we need them to do right now. That's the paying of the postage, that's educating our public to the opportunities they have, whether it's voting by mail, whether it's voting on election day, whether it's voting early. The other one would be to extend early voting. I think the supervisors now are asking to extend early voting to 22 days from 14 to 22 days. I personally would like to see extended early voting extended through election day. Yeah. Now, I'm not an expert anymore, but I would love to see that opportunity for people to have that convenience if early voting is their choice. But again, being that vote by mail voter, I think we've said it all. It's safe, secure. If people are worried about walking into an early voting site, if they're worried about going to an election day site, that is the way to go. And I love to tell people, it is the ballot you literally can track from the Division of Elections website, or you can track from your own supervisor elections website, as well as following some of the other supervisors around the state, like Seminole County, and I think the supervisor in Broward have just begun to mail out vote by mail requests to encourage their voters to just take that opportunity. So it's not that voter having to think about it and requesting themselves. Those supervisors are being proactive in mailing those vote by mail requests out now. And so if I had that magic wand, I would encourage and I would want all of the supervisors to do that. But it all goes back to our supervisors having the funding in order to be able to accomplish what we're asking from them. And that's having the equipment, that's having the number of ballots they need in order to have this vote by mail increase happen, because it's going to require more ballots. And so it's just the funding and the resources are needed. So definitely the 21 billion that's supposed to be coming down from federal government. We would like to direct our governor to give that money to our supervisors so they can put the proper infrastructure in place.
Excellent point. And I don't know a single supervisor, and I know probably all of them, who doesn't need more resources. They don't appreciate unfunded mandates, but they do appreciate it when the legislature and the governor pays attention to their actual resource needs. Listen, that brings this panel discussion to a close. I want to thank all of our panel of experts for taking the time to join us today and sharing their thoughts on these very important topics. I also want to thank everyone who has been watching at home from Facebook Live, from YouTube, and from Twitter. You can find more information about voting by mail and a link to request your vote by mail ballot from your local supervisor of elections by going to fl.dems.vote/mail. That's fl.dems.vote/mail. If you're interested in learning more about the Florida Democratic Party and joining us in future conversations, be sure to like and subscribe to the Florida Democratic Party on social media. Thank you all so much for attending and participating, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you to our superb panel. Thank you.